Hello everyone, myself Dr. Vandana Raghav, Professor, Department of Management Sciences, Tecnia Institute of Advanced Studies. Today, I am going to deliver lecture on the law of diminishing marginal utility. The law of diminishing marginal utility was first defined by German economist Hermann Heinrich Giesen in the year 1854. The law is known as the first law of Giesen, and later on it was popularized by Alfred Marshall. Now I will define what is law of diminishing marginal utility. The law of diminishing marginal utility describes a familiar and fundamental tendency of human behavior. The law of diminishing marginal utility states that as a consumer consumes more and more unit of a specific commodity, utility derives from every successive units goes on diminishing. According to Alfred Marshall, the law of diminishing marginal utility is defined as the additional utility which a person derives from an increase of his stock of a commodity diminishes with every increase in the stock that he or she already has. The law states that the additional level of satisfaction goes on diminishing with every increase in units of consumption within the same period of time. When a consumer consumes more and more units of the same commodity, the successive level of utility diminishes. Or we can say that the law states that as we consume more and more units of the same commodity, the marginal utility derived after every successive unit goes on diminishing. Now, I will explain the assumptions of this law. There are certain assumptions of this law. The law of diminishing marginal utility is based on the following assumptions. The first assumption is the consumer should be rational. The consumer is regarded as the rational person who aims to maximize their satisfaction with their perfect knowledge required to maximize the satisfaction of the constraint imposed by the income and the commodities. The second assumption is cardinal measurement of utility. The consumption utility of any commodity can be measured. It is measured that satisfaction can be measured in the same way that the natural units of consumption can be calculated. Third assumption is constant marginal utility of money. This theory assumes utility can be measured in terms of ordinal numbers. The basis of measurement of utility is money. Money is the measuring rod of utility. Being a measuring rod of utility, the marginal utility, the money remains constant over the period of assumption. And the next assumption is homogeneous units of goods. The unit of goods consumed by the consumer must be homogeneous. That is, it must be same in shape, size, quality, odor, taste, etc. Otherwise, the law will not apply. The fifth assumption is no change in taste and preferences of the consumer. It is required that the preferences of the consumer do not change. Only then we can assume that the marginal utility decline as the consumption increases. The law of diminishing marginal utility can be explained by means of numerical table and geometrically with a diagram which is given below. In this given table, in the first column, units of goods which we consume is given, and in the next columns, total utility and the marginal utility was given. If suppose we consume zero amount of any commodity, the total utility and the marginal utility we derived is 0. If suppose we consume first unit of that commodity, the total utility is 10 and the marginal utility is also 10. And if suppose we consume second unit of the same commodity, the total utility increases from 10 to 18, but the marginal utility decreases from 10 to 8. The third commodity which we consume, it increases the total utility from 18 to 24, which shows that the marginal utility derived from the third commodity, it decreases from 8 to 6. The fourth commodity, if we consume, it gives total utility up to 28 utiles, which shows that the marginal utility derived from that fourth commodity goes on diminishing from 6 to 4. Again, if suppose we consume one more unit of that commodity, the total utility is now 30, which shows that the marginal utility increases only 2. That means it diminishes from 4 to 2 units. The sixth commodity shows the increase in the marginal utility from 28 to 30, but the marginal utility derived from the sixth commodity goes on diminishes to -2. The seventh commodity shows decline in the total utility. The marginal utility keeps on declining from -2 to -4. This table shows that a consumption goes on increasing, the additional utility or marginal utility that the consumer obtained by consuming each successive units of good X goes on diminishing till it goes down to 0 at the 6th unit, and it becomes negative if the 7th unit consumed. The total utility goes on increasing until the consumption of 5th unit, and in the 6th unit the total utility stays constant but decrease in the 7th unit. The total utility increases at a diminishing rate. It is due to the diminishing marginal utility that the total utility increases at a diminishing rate. Now, I will explain this thing with the help of the diagram. In this figure, marginal utility of commodity X and the marginal utility curves, which is derived on the basis of an individual consumption of successive units of commodity X. Marginal utility is downward sloping curve, which means marginal utility derives from every commodity or every successive commodity X goes on diminishing throughout the above of the X axis and indicates negative utility. When the marginal utility is positive, the total utility increases at a diminishing rate by a downward sloping portion of the total utility curve. The total utility is maximum at its when the marginal utility at its 0. When the marginal utility curve touches its 0, it means total utility is at its maximum. At the 5th unit, marginal utility becomes 0 and the state of maximum satisfaction and total utility of 5th unit is 30. When marginal utility becomes negative, the total utility curve starts to fall by the downward sloping portion of total utility curve. There are certain limitations of this law. The law of diminishing marginal utility is based on certain assumptions. In most of the time, the assumptions are applicable. The law is not applicable in the case of following situations. Rare and curious goods. In the case of rare goods such as old stamps, old coins, antique items, etc., the marginal utility goes on increasing rather than decreasing. So the law does not hold true in that kind of situation. Habitual goods. Several consumers may be habitual with different goods like cigarette, alcohol, etc. When consumer consumes more and more unit of such goods, additional level of satisfaction goes on increasing rather than decreasing. The third assumption is not applicable in case of irrational consumers. The law assumes the consumer is a rational consumer. He aims to maximize his utility. The theory is applicable in the case of only rational consumers. However, it is very difficult to find the rational consumer as expected by the law. The next assumption is utility cannot be measured in cardinal numbers. We cannot measure utility in numbers like 1, 2 or 3. This theory assumes that the satisfaction can be measured in units, but the critics said that utility is an internal feeling of the consumer and it differs from person to person, so it cannot be measured in numbers. It can only rank them like more or less, or we can give more preference to some commodity as comparison to some another. The next assumption is no time gap in consumption. The law assumes the consumer consumes various of a commodity continuously in a short period of time. Therefore, the law is not applicable if the consumer consumes the commodity in a long period of time with break or gaps. The next assumption is taste and preference will remain constant. The law is applicable if and only if the taste and preference of the consumer will remain constant throughout this law. In the case of changing taste and preference, the law is not applicable. Goods of entertainment. The law of diminishing marginal utility is not applicable in the case of goods of entertainment, activities like watching movies, T20 cricket, etc. The future watching of these provides entertainment and thus satisfaction does not decrease. This law is not applicable on public goods and basic goods. People consume various public goods like road, street, lights, etc. Likewise, they consume many basic goods like food, clothes, etc. In the use of these goods, the level of satisfaction from additional units does not decrease. So, it is against this law. There are certain importance of the law of diminishing marginal utilities. We can use this law for guidelines for taxation. It guides the finance minister while formulating the tax policy. A progressive tax policy, high tax for high income people and low tax for lower income people is based upon the marginal utility theory. Basis for price determination. When a marginal utility is at least equal to its price, consumer desire to purchase the good. The consumer will pay a higher price for those having higher marginal utility and vice versa. Guidelines for the distribution of national income. The distribution of wealth and national income should be done as per the guidelines of marginal utility theory. Since the demand of rich people beyond certain has a diminishing marginal utility, whereas if the government distribute the wealth to poor, it has definitely a higher marginal utility. Basis for various laws of economics. Various laws in economics are based on a law of diminishing marginal utility. For example, law of demand, a law of substitution, etc. These laws are derived from the law of diminishing marginal utility. The next thing is basis for consumer expenditure. This law is important to regulate the expenditure of the consumers. The consumer has a limited amount of budget. So, they do not waste budget by purchasing more quantities. They stop their further purchases at a point where marginal utility equals to its price. This is all about the law of diminishing marginal utility, its assumptions, limitations and the importance of this law. That's all.